Fran is the head of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, and she also is now a special advisor to the State Department on the Arctic. But Fran, before you begin, I have something to read.
Okay.
Although we invited EPA participation, unfortunately, due to several calendar conflicts, we were not able to secure EPA's participation. I'm reading a statement prepared by EPA. We plan to share the path forward discussion with EPA as well as seeking insights with EPA through other opportunities. That is the statement that they asked me to read. So, Fred, you... I know. I think the people who submitted this are from headquarters. You are rogue.
I'm not rogue. I'm actually here.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am very sorry that I wasn't able to be with you yesterday. I was in Toronto for the Transatlantic Science Conference, which is something done by Norway, Canada, and the US annually. And interestingly enough, our topic was the Arctic and industrial activity that we need to work on risk mitigation. So it was sort of a warm-up for this morning. We're going to go from the Kentucky River to the Chukchi. And so be prepared for sort of a hyperleap up to the north. What I'm going to do this morning is provide, first of all, just a little context about the Arctic. I'm assuming that there are quite a few people in this room who know a lot about the Arctic, but I'm going to guess that there are some who might not. So I'm just going to do a little bit of sort of orientation, why this is relevant and timely. I'll talk a bit about why the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Commission that I served on addressed frontier areas, what's happened since then, and some of the things that I think we might need to actually work on. Seeing that I have about a 3-hour speech that I'm going to condense into 15 minutes, I'm going to touch on a lot of things very lightly. So my apologies for kind of going through things in a somewhat superficial manner. That's all we have time for. For most of you know, I think, that the Arctic is changing perhaps more rapidly than any other place on Earth. It is changing in many different ways in terms of the disappearance of some of the things that we have come to accept as normal. What is today is not what was yesterday, and what will be tomorrow is not what is today. And that's sometimes hard for humans to get their heads around, but it's incredibly important, particularly for people who try to deliver services or plan for things like oil spills, because we are in a very dynamic environment with less sea ice, warmer temperatures, thawing permafrost, et cetera, and so forth. But largely of interest for those of us who live in Alaska is that more and more people actually care about the Arctic than used to. It used to be sort of like the Arctic is way out there, and what's that all about, and why is it relevant to me? A lot more attention is being paid, in part because of the rather stunning loss of sea ice. And when I say stunning, I mean if you compare it to when we sort of started with satellite observations back in the late 1970s, 50% less sea ice in extent and 75% less sea ice in volume at the summer minimums. That is stunning by way of a change in terms of the fundamental ecosystem and all of the ice-dependent species that call the Arctic home. That is a large driver behind a lot of the things that we are talking about now. But it's more than just climate change and more accessibility to the region. It's also, frankly, the fact that there is a lot of global interest, there's a lot of global demand for resources, and the Arctic is rich in many, many ways. The additional access is bringing a lot of speculation about shipping routes and the possibility of either the Northern Sea route over Russia or the Northwest Passage over Canada becoming increasingly an opportune effort for those who wish to shorten the shipping route through the Suez or through the Panama Canal. We could talk a whole hour about this. I'm not going to accept to say that we have to remember that the sea ice in the summer is reduced, but there's still sea ice in the winter. So it's a very short period of time that the sea ice is actually less than it used to be. Now, it is true that the sea ice that is there in the winter is younger ice. It's newer ice, which means it's less, it is easier to get through it and punch through it with an icebreaker, but there's still ice there, which is a word of caution for those who think that this is something that's about to happen tomorrow. It is happening. There is an increase in shipping, and I don't mean to make light of that or the importance to do the kind of prevention, protection, and anticipation of what that means to coastal communities, what that means in terms of responding both for emergencies and for spills, but we have to remember what the realities are. The oil and gas in the Arctic is considerable. USGS has estimated that 13% of the remaining undiscovered oil in the world is in the Arctic and 30% of the natural gas. This is not, I want to make it clear here, I'm talking about the Arctic as a whole. I'm not talking about the Alaskan Arctic when I use these numbers. So it remains to be seen exactly how much is where, in what quantities, and what is economically recoverable. All of those things are another topic. But having said that, there is a lot of interest. There are a lot of energy companies around the world that are very interested in the Arctic and are at different levels of either obtaining leases, permits, making investments, moving forward with technology development. This is something that is happening because of the projection that the oil is there. Just to situate yourself in terms of the Alaskan Arctic, the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea, which is where the Department of Interior leased additional development opportunities, Shell, ConocoPhillips, Statoil. That is where you have a lot of attention, but the history of oil development in Alaska, for those of you who don't know Alaska very well, is at Prudhoe Bay on land, on state land. Big difference. The development at Prudhoe Bay, largest oil field ever discovered in North America. Huge. It's an elephant field. It is in decline, and it is on state land, which is why the state of Alaska has reaped significant financial benefits from it. The Chukchi and Beaufort leases, the OCS development is federal waters, no state revenue sharing, which really changes the dynamics quite a bit in terms of where the revenue flows. But having said that, needless to say, because of the decline of oil coming out of Prudhoe Bay, the state of Alaska and the businesses of Alaska are very interested in trying to find additional throughput for that line to keep it going. So again, we could spend a whole hour talking about the challenges associated with doing development in the Arctic. It's pretty obvious. It's cold, it's dark, it's remote, it has little infrastructure, and it's kind of a dangerous place to operate. Now, having said that, the Arctic is not the same everywhere. The Arctic in Tromsø, Norway is quite a bit different than the Arctic in Barrow, Alaska. So if these are generalizations. In some places, there is some pretty sophisticated infrastructure, like in Norway. In other places, not so much. So this is a generalization, but as it relates more specifically to the US Arctic and to Alaska, we have very limited infrastructure. When I compare the infrastructure and response capacity that existed in the Gulf of Mexico after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, in comparison to the infrastructure and the capacity to respond in the Arctic, we are really talking, the difference between Mars and Jupiter. These are wildly different places, and you have to kind of prepare for the fact in your own mind that pretty much everything that was there that made it easier to respond to that spill in Louisiana just doesn't exist in Alaska. Now, having said that, Alaskans have been very innovative in providing mechanisms in some regions, particularly in Prince William Sound after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, in terms of standing up capacity. But that capacity does not exist statewide, or at least it looks different pretty much wherever you are. So what does this mean to the people who live in the Arctic? And I think it's really important to remember that 4 million people live across the Arctic. This is not a place that is devoid of population. This is a place where indigenous people have lived for literally thousands of years in incredibly challenging conditions. They live close to the lands and to the waters, and for generations have relied upon marine mammals and fish and birds and harvesting off the land to be able to live in this challenging place. So the possibility of industrial development and its impact on food security, on subsistence, on culture, and because of the climate change that is having dramatic impact on coastal communities, particularly on Western Alaska, where a couple dozen communities in Alaska have already been identified by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as having to move because of coastal erosion, because of thawing permafrost, because of a variety of factors. Big impacts, not only because of climate change, but also because of the possibility of additional industrial commercial development. So just take a moment here, because again, in terms of understanding why we are talking about oil development in a place that is as challenging as the Arctic, I think it's important to remember that there are many different ways of looking at the risks and rewards associated with oil development. And you have to understand that, I think, that there are people who are very concerned about how it will change their life, how it will change the food security and subsistence lifestyle. There are people who are very concerned about continuing the jobs and local business opportunities and the revenues to their community and to the state associated with oil development. There are many people in the state of Alaska who have never been to the North Slope, have never been to Kaktovik or to Wainwright, have never seen a whale being harvested and shared in the community, who are really just kind of interested in making sure that they don't have to pay property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, or anything else, because they want the dollars to continue to flow. That's understandable too, given that we live in a state that has had the incredible good fortune of having the largest oil field in North America, and an incredibly productive one. So there are lots of different interests here, but pretty much everybody is interested in the topic of avoiding an oil spill. Everybody shares that value, regardless of how they come to this question. That's kind of a common denominator. The question isn't really so much, do you want to do something about avoiding an oil spill, or how do you clean up an oil spill? But in our case, how do you do it in icy waters? And how do you do it in a place with very limited infrastructure? And how do you do it where it's really dark for a lot of the year? This really raises the bar in terms of our capacity, our planning, our being prepared, our doing training, our having the right technology, techniques, and capacity to respond. That is why the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Commission, on which I served, actually addressed frontier areas. It wasn't our main mission. Our main mission was to try to better understand what went wrong in Macondo and make recommendations to improve the safety and reduce the risk that it would happen again. But our commission felt strongly that we needed to look at frontier areas and at least partially address that question of what it is that the United States should do about frontier areas. And we made several recommendations. And those recommendations are probably pretty obvious in terms of additional scientific research, international drilling standards for best practices in the Arctic, addressing oil spill response and being better prepared than we are now. But I just want to read one thing from our short version of the report. The Department of Interior should ensure that the containment and response plans proposed by industry are adequate for each stage of development, and that the underlying financial and technical capabilities have been satisfied and satisfactorily demonstrated in the Arctic. The Coast Guard and the oil companies operating in the Arctic should carefully delineate their respective responsibilities in the event of an accident, including search and rescue, and build and deploy the necessary capabilities. And Congress should provide the resources to establish Coast Guard capabilities in the Arctic based on the Coast Guard's review of current and projected gaps in its capacity. That's sort of it in a nutshell. We need to have industry and government work together. We need to have them focus on what actually is going to be required, and instead of waiting until it is needed, step out ahead and do what needs to be done in terms of resourcing the necessary facilities, capacities, and agencies. I'll leave it to you to decide how much that has happened. Let me offer a couple of good news things about what has happened since that report was written. And there are many more than I could list, but I'm going to list a few just because I don't want, the entire session to be about what hasn't happened. We recommended that Minerals Management Service be separated. It was. Bessie, BOEM, and ONNR have moved forward in a very different way than MMS did. The SEMS regs, which were permissive, became mandatory. They have been revised. In terms of safety, that is an incredibly important piece of the regulatory regime in our country. The President adopted an executive order that gave to the Department of Interior the responsibility to coordinate energy permitting in the Arctic, which was chaired by David Hayes, which really brought agencies together in a more coordinated fashion than they were prior to that disaster. There has been increased investment in research, particularly in oil spill research in the Arctic, but also in understanding the environment. Through Bessie and Interior, through NOAA, through other federal agencies, but also industry and universities. The ICOPAR, the Interagency Coordinating Committee on Oil Spill Response and Preparation, I can never get it quite right, but it's ICOPAR, which is chaired by the Coast Guard, has stood up and has become much more active than it was prior to the Macondo. It doesn't just focus on the Arctic, it focuses on oil spill in general, but it has been sort of a clarion call within the federal agencies to be more focused, which is good. NOAA learned a lot about creating an IRMA, an environmental management capacity in the Gulf. They are now standing that up in the Arctic, which would enable responders for a variety of reasons to be able to have a better sense of sort of the environmental awareness of the conditions that would be necessary for response or for action. The Department of Interior is in the process of promulgating Arctic-specific oil and gas regulations. They are at OMB right now for review, and they are moving forward. Again, it's something that our commission called for. Our commission called for the U.S. being leaders in this regard internationally. I'm not sure we could call ourselves that, but it's another step forward, which is great. Bessie has just completed their oil spill response gap in the Arctic. It's on the web. It's something, we all understand that it's important to do response gap analyses. Canada does that, other nations do that. Bessie, I haven't read it, so I don't know how good it is, but it's there, it's on the web. And the US adopted a national strategy for the Arctic in 2013. Again, raising the bar in terms of understanding the importance of the Arctic to the entire country, but also focusing energy and interest at federal agency levels. Now, many of them have done their own Arctic strategy. NOAA, Navy, Department of Interior, on and on, have done their own strategies consistent with the National Arctic Strategy. So all of this is progress. If you look at where we were at Macondo to where we are today in terms of attention being paid to the Arctic in a way that does matter and does better prepare. And I'm not even covering what's being done at the state level. Ed Page is here. I'm sure he's talked about the Marine Exchange. And DEC has done a lot of work in terms of coordinating with communities and sister states and Canada. So I'm just hitting a few things for the federal government. And there's been a lot of work done on this question of what other research should be done in responding to spills. Because Deb is here, I'm not going to talk about what NRC has done and the recent report that was released this summer. I'm sure she will. The Arctic Research Commission, which I chair, did a similar report a few years ago. There's action going on. And that's the good news, and I probably only have about 3 minutes left. But I do want to address briefly the Arctic Council, because the Arctic Council may be well known to some of you, but not to others, and I want you to know it because there are resources there that would be useful to you in the work you do and in your level of awareness about the international coordination and collaboration that is done on really important issues as it relates to the Arctic, particularly as it relates to its two principal focus areas, which is, number one, protection of the environment in the Arctic, and number two, promotion of sustainable development in the Arctic. That's what really, those were the two principal pillars, so to speak, on which the Arctic Council was formed back in 1996 and in the various meetings that led up to that. 8 Arctic states, permanent participants reflecting the indigenous populations of the North, a whole host of other observing nations work together through both task forces and working groups that focus on important issues. And there have been many things that they have done that focus on the topic here at this meeting. So PAIM, the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, did the Arctic Offshore Oil and Gas Guidelines, how to do oil and gas development safely in the Arctic, back in 2009, I think. PAIM also did guidelines for how to transfer refined oil in the Arctic, a great blueprint if you really want to go someplace and see an international collaborative effort of sort of laying out how to do it. This spring, PAIM also completed a 2-year process on how to improve the safety culture in the oil and gas industry and how important that is if you really want to get at the front end of the problem, that is prevention, reducing the risks, increasing the system strength that will protect against human error, which is a piece of every organization. A guide on oil spill response in snow and ice was done by EPPR, the Emergency Preparedness and Response Working Group. Recommended practices for oil and gas oil spill prevention. The Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, which was sort of a seminal item that really brought focus to the need for a mandatory IMO polar code instead of just a voluntary one. And the implementation report that came out after that about a year ago. So these are just a few of the things that if you went to the Arctic Council website, you would be able to find by way of tools that could be useful to you in the work that you do, particularly if you do work in the Arctic. I want to mention one other piece of this before I sit down, and that is that in addition to organizations like the Arctic Council and the IMO, there is also in the Arctic a pretty good example, there are others, but I'll use this one, of bilateral cooperation to reduce the risk associated with oil and gas development, and hence make our discussions about actually having to clean up a spill in the Arctic less timely. This is an example of one. Russia and Norway came together back in 2007 and started working on an agreement of how they will increase standards for oil and gas development in the Barents Sea. They had 7 teams of international experts that worked on a variety of questions associated with making oil and gas development safer, coming up with common standards to be used in that region for any oil development. And why is this relevant? Because Norway and Russia resolved its border dispute, and that area is one that is very prime for oil and gas development, with the understanding it would probably happen on both sides of that border. So the idea that they are actually coming up with common standards and setting a high bar for the industries that will be working in that region makes so much sense. And I think it's a guide for what not only can be done by others, perhaps the US and Canada, perhaps the US and Russia if our relationship improves. There are opportunities to learn from others, is all I'm saying. And Barents 2020, which was supported by DNV, but which had an incredible list of experts that brought together the Russian knowledge of ice and the Norwegian expertise in oil development, and really produced something pretty stunning that might be useful in other places. So my final message here is that, yes, it is very important that conferences like this one bring the experts about oil spill response together to talk about planning, to talk about research, to talk about preparation, to talk about training. But I think the most important message I want to leave you with is it doesn't matter how much oil gets in the water, you're not going to clean it all up. And boy, Exxon, Valdez, and Deepwater Horizon demonstrate quite clearly that you just can't get it all. Matter of fact, you can only get maybe 10% of it if you're lucky. So the best strategy is to keep it from getting in the water in the first place. And that's all about prevention. That's about Arctic standards that are appropriate to the circumstances and the high levels of risk. It means getting industry to do what it has done in the Gulf of Mexico with API, the Center for Offshore Safety, doing something that sets a higher bar for the collaboration of those companies that are doing business in the Arctic to do something similar in terms of safety levels in the Arctic. It means doing a whole host of things that really are not things that can wait until after the accident, but really need to be done as a mode of prevention. Why? Because people live in the Arctic. They rely on the resources of the Arctic. It is a very vulnerable and yet valuable place, and we have a high degree of responsibility. We as not just US citizens, not we just as Arctic residents, but we as members of the Earth. In closing, let me say, out on the table you will find copies of the Arctic Research Commission's goals. I do not want to take them with me to Iceland when I leave there to go to Iceland tomorrow. I want you to take one home with you. They're out on the table. We'll give you a sense for what I don't have time to cover in terms of what we do. But I do want, for those of you who care about the Arctic and don't already sign up for the daily update and electronic newsletter that we do every single day, that tells you about interesting research, policy announcements by elected officials, upcoming important meetings, workshops, et cetera, that you might want to attend. If you go to arctic.gov, you can sign up for it, arctic.gov, and you can be informed every single day about what's going on in the Arctic. Thank you very much.